In this video, we're going to continue on our discussion of environmental market failures, and we're going to focus on a key aspect of capitalism in general that really does not work well when we're dealing with resource issues and issues of sustainable use. And the two issues are externalities and perverse subsidies. Following the lectures on the free market and property rights, we used the concepts of excludability and depletability to organize goods and services into four different groups across the matrix. And the matrix had private goods, toll goods, global commons, and public goods. We then discussed the open access problem of the global commons and the free rider issues with public goods. Both of these market failures relate to globally shared resources or ecosystem services. In this lecture, we're going to talk about externalities, which relate to globally shared effects of human activities, and perverse subsidies. Let's start with definitions, and we're going to talk about the definition of externalities. An externality is the cost or benefit of the production or consumption of a good or service that is experienced by people other than the producer or the consumer. So in this situation, we not only have a seller and a buyer, as we saw in our discussion of how the free market works, but also we have a third party that is affected by the transaction without being directly involved in that transaction. Now, externalities can be either positive or negative. Negative externalities related to the negative impacts of production and consumption of a good or service that a third party experiences without having any choice or getting compensation for that negative externality. Examples of negative externalities are the effects of pollution, of deforestation, or pesticide use that everyone has to endure, even if they did not get a direct benefit from the economic activity that caused those effects. In this context, you might also hear the term, quote, public bad, which is the symmetric opposite of a public good. A public bad is a negative good or service that must be consumed by everyone, from which no one can be excluded. Other possibly more tangible examples of negative externalities are sleep deprivation due to a neighbor listening to loud music late at night, or secondhand smoke, or increasing pool of antibiotic resistant bacteria because of the continuous overuse of antibiotics. In all of these cases, the person experiencing the negative effects did not gain a benefit from the initial transaction. This cartoon is good at illustrating the essence of negative externalities. The partner of this man must have sprayed the roses with a pesticide to get nicer flowers. So the spraying of pesticides was an interaction between the gardener and the roses. However, the negative consequences of this action are experienced by the man, and mainly the fish, who did not have any choice in the matter. Acid rain is something that you've probably heard about, and it's caused by the emissions of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide, which then react with water molecules in the atmosphere, and this produces acid. And these acids eventually come back down to Earth as they're washed out in what's known as acid rain, or in fact, acid snow. The emissions responsible for the acid are sulfur and nitrogen compounds from human sources, often from electricity generation when they burn coal, or animal agriculture, factories, and vehicle emissions. Electrical power generation using coal is among the greatest contributors to this pollution that's responsible for acid rain. And the negative environmental effects of acid rain are severe. The high acidity of the rain causes the surface water systems, such as lakes and rivers, to become too acidic for fish and aquatic plants to survive. The high acidity also negatively affects soils, terrestrial ecosystems, and agricultural productivity. And all the runoff eventually ends up in the ocean, and this further promotes ocean acidification. In addition, the acidity in the rain, it just damages buildings, historical monuments, statues made of limestone and marble, because the calcium carbonate in these statues is dissolved by the acidic rain. So in this case, the third party is the ecosystem that had no benefit from the power generation. And so acid rain is an externality to this power generation, a negative externality. Now, an additional challenge with acid rain and many other environmental negative externalities is that those negative externalities don't stay put in one place. Instead, they can move across international boundaries. They could be, in this case, the acid rainstorms could be blown across by the prevailing winds, and they end up affecting people and ecosystems in places other than where the economic benefits were created. This is generally referred to as, surprisingly enough, or not surprisingly, transboundary negative externalities. So the blue dots shown on this map are the major sources of sulfur dioxide in North America in 2005. And you can see that they're mainly in the US. The light blue areas are the sensitive areas that were most likely affected by the acid rain resulting from these emissions, which are mainly in eastern Canada. Similar transboundary exports of acid rain occurred in Europe, where Scandinavia and Eastern Europe were affected by the emissions of the coal-fired plants in Great Britain and Central Europe, or Taiwan, which suffers the effects of emissions from China. Now, because no compensation is paid to the third party experiencing these damages, the consumers of these goods are not paying the full societal costs of their production and consumption. This means that the products are way too cheap, and as a result, goods and services with negative externalities are typically overproduced and overconsumed. Let's look at climate change from the perspective of negative externalities. The activity or economic transition that we're talking about is the burning of fossil fuels. That's the product or good or service that is being consumed, produced and consumed. The users are primarily the industrialized nations, because the Industrial Revolution took place in industrialized nations. That's the definition of industrialized nations. And those nations use this technology of burning fossil fuels to propel their people to new standards of living. The negative effects of the consumption of fossil fuels are obvious, and we've talked about these a bunch of times, but the key ones are climate change, sea level rise, and ocean acidification. Now, the third parties in this situation are large proportions of the global population, particularly in the global south, who didn't and still, in many respects, have not benefited directly from the burning of fossil fuels, certainly not at the scale it's done in the global north. Also, the third parties include all the non-human components of the global ecosystem. Third parties also include the future generations of all species on the planet, including humans, who, again, are not directly benefiting from the current burning of fossil fuels. So all of these parties did not enjoy the benefits of fossil fuels, nor did they have a say in whether or not fossil fuels should be used. However, all of these groups, non-human components of the global ecosystem, large portions of the global south, in terms of human populations and future generations of all species, none of these had a say in the use of fossil fuels, but all of those groups will carry the brunt and the resulting consequences of burning fossil fuels into the future. Climate change is therefore the globally shared negative externalities of the consumption of fossil fuels. So I'll say that again, that climate change is a globally shared negative externality, and it results from the consumption of fossil fuels. Now, what are the solutions for combating externalities over production and overconsumption of goods and services that result from products and services that have negative externalities? One of the key approaches is to internalize the cost of negative externalities so that the price of the good or service that's producing those negative externalities, the price of that good or service better reflects the true societal cost of the production and consumption of whatever it is, like burning fossil fuels, that causes those negative externalities. In the case of acid rain, including the cost of the environmental damage into the price of electricity when it's coming from coal-fired power plants would create the necessary economic incentives to use less energy and potentially to develop alternatives. Similarly, including the cost of environmental damages into the price of fossil fuels would encourage consumers to curb their consumption and to search for alternatives. This is exactly what the carbon tax or cap and trade systems are trying to achieve. The additional readings for this lecture will provide you with some background on what British Columbia and what Canada are doing with respect to pricing carbon. Now, the taxes aimed to combat negative externalities are called Pigouvian taxes, named after an English economist. A Pigouvian tax is any type of tax that intends to correct an undesirable or inefficient market outcome by adding in the social costs of the negative externalities, adding those into the cost of the actual activity. Now, while Pigouvian taxes are a good idea, there are also considerable challenges with them. First, Pigouvian taxes are not effective at addressing transboundary externalities because the people who are actually experiencing the negative effects don't get the tax money. The second issue is that it is incredibly challenging to describe the damages to ecosystems or the lost opportunities for future generations. It's hard to describe these in dollars in a meaningful way. And because there are no clear objective answers to this challenge, the use of Pigouvian taxes can easily turn into a political issue that's really just driven by opinions. Now, externalities can also be positive. In this case, an activity creates positive effect for an unrelated third party. And there are many examples of positive externalities, but here are a few. The positive externality of a beekeeper having bees to make honey is that all of the surrounding crops get pollinated. Another example of a positive externality is the construction of an airport or SkyTrain, and that benefits the local businesses that are along the SkyTrain route. And having a really well-maintained and attractive house on a street benefits the neighbors because the property values of all the neighbors' houses tend to be higher than if that really well-maintained attractive house wasn't there. Now, as you can probably imagine, since the third party that profits from the positive externality doesn't actually pay for the benefit, the activities that produce important positive externalities are typically underfunded and therefore underprovided. So it's exactly the opposite of negative externalities. Now, what I want to briefly talk about are perverse subsidies before we finish our discussion of market failures. And I'll talk about these in the context of environmental goods and services. In general, subsidies are a form of financial aid to support a business or an individual, typically given by the government to address market failures. The idea is to steer the market in a way that increases public welfare or promotes the provision of a public good. We already briefly mentioned subsidies when we talked about how governments can step in to address the free rider problem. Now, subsidies can be direct, like grants or scholarships, or indirect, like tax breaks, low interest loans, or rebates. In all of these cases, the idea is to create incentives that encourage the production of desirable goods and services. So you can think of subsidies as the inverse of taxes. Taxes are aimed to curb the consumption and production of socially undesirable goods and services by making those undesirable goods and services more expensive. Subsidies are there to increase the consumption and production of socially desirable goods and services. Some examples of common subsidies are subsidies to industry sectors like agriculture, forestry, or fisheries. The main focus here is to encourage domestic production and to protect jobs. Another example is student loans, which are there to promote people getting higher education. It is in the best interest of a country to have a well-educated population. Now, while all subsidies start with good intentions, they can have unintended consequences, and this is where the term perverse subsidy comes in. A subsidy is considered perverse when the net effect actually reduces public welfare in the long term. This often happens through unintended environmental impacts, and examples of this include yield-based subsidies to farmers that encourages them to overproduce, or subsidies that promote the expansion of a fishing fleet that simply speeds up the depletion of remaining fish stocks. In both cases, the intent to protect jobs or create new jobs results in environmental degradation that actually destroys the foundation of those jobs in the long term. Another challenge of subsidies that it's really hard to get rid of them because they have often been around for a long time, and then people have a sense of entitlement, and sectors have strong lobby groups behind them in order to keep these subsidies in place. The threat of losing jobs in the short term is a powerful political force. Now, having money tied up in these questionable subsidies furthermore reduces opportunities for spending money on useful incentives, such as environmental conservation attempts, education, health, or critical infrastructure that actually could increase public welfare. So this brings us to the end of our discussion of market failures in the context of environmental goods and services. In the last lecture, we focused on the market failures associated with globally shared resources. And there, we saw that global commons tend to get overused and depleted because of the open access issue. We also saw that global public goods tend to be underproduced and underprotected because of the free rider problem. In this lecture, we learned that products and services associated with negative externalities are generally overproduced and overconsumed because these goods and services are too cheap. After listening to these two lectures, you should be able to explain the mechanics behind each of these market failures, should be able to provide examples for them, and describe possible solutions for combating these market failures. We also touched on the idea of perverse subsidies, which relate to unintended and often environmental negative effects of well-intended government subsidies. So that's it for this section on